Welcome everyone to another podcast, and this time Fiona and I are going to give you a sense of a conference that was put on. It's back in October now. It was arranged by SIC, the Scottish Independence Convention team, and they worked with a European group called ISEC, International Commission for European Citizens. They brought people from 10 different groups that are working for more autonomy within Europe. So, for example, Catalonia within Spain. We went along to it. It was held over in Greyfriars Church in Edinburgh. It was just an afternoon. It was really interesting, wasn't it?
All these different groups just giving us their story and their perspective, and how much of it resonated with us. Almost this sort of playbook of how to suppress a culture in evidence, and all these groups fighting back against it. It was quite inspirational. So we've chosen some clips we thought were particularly interesting. I mean, if you want to watch the full event, it's available on Independence Live's YouTube channel.
One thing we just wanted to remark on before we start was there's quite a lot of criticism coming from the speakers towards the country that they're part of. So
it's context, in the context of the discussions we were having, they were critical of their state in the same way as we're critical of the United Kingdom. We are still completely pro-EU. You hear this criticism about being ruled by Brussels and the usual troll comments. These are all states acting in relation to what they want to do to smaller parts within their state. It's not at an EU level.
Aside from that, it was just really interesting to listen to everybody think. We'll just show you one thing before we go into the actual clips. It's just the people who were there, and it was just refreshing to hear everyone coming together to speak together. They obviously really appreciated the invite to come to Scotland. It was also clear that the referendum 10 years back been an inspiration to them.
That was a surprise, wasn't it? I didn't realise just how much of an influence we'd had on them.
I'll tell you, they were an inspiration to us. So let's start off and go to the clips.
So the first speaker is from the Basque country.
We need to own our own future. We don't have time. There is a climate crisis that we have to tackle. We have housing problem that we have to tackle. We have migration problem that we have to tackle. We have work issues. We have health and education. And we don't have 50 years to wait for it. If we remain in Spain or in France, it is very complicated because, for example, in the case of Spain, whatever our parliament, the Basque parliament approves, later on the Spanish Supreme Court or Spanish tribunals decide is unconstitutional. Emergency laws that we made for tackling the climate issue, whatever, this is all lost because of the very conservative Spanish mentality. Conservative also about their money, but then they have tax havens. They are very conservative and they are very right-wing and they are not doing the right thing. So we need to run away from a jail called Spain and called France. And also because of the language. I didn't mention it, but the language is in a critical situation.
The Basque country is between Spain and France.
I mean, it was that bit about that the Spanish government can just weigh in and say, oh yeah, you passed that in the Basque parliament, but you can't do that. And they've obviously got more authority, and they can stop things happening. And there is a bit of that happens here in Scotland when Westminster weighs in, and then of course there's the whole thing about the internal market that Westminster set up after Brexit. They can step in and say, yeah, that's devolved, but we're setting up a Great British. It's always Great British, isn't it? Internal market. So you've got to allow. You can't do that. It's got to be what we want for the whole of Britain. So that struck me. I
mean, the other thing that struck me is just right at the beginning saying we don't have time. We've got all these issues now. All these issues are the same as our issues. We need to be independent to start tackling them. Continuing with the same speaker. This next clip was really interesting because if you remember a conversation we had a while back with Professor Alf Baird. And he was talking, he'd done a study on decolonization and the effects of colonialism. And one of the things he found was that national parliaments in the process of decolonization sort of align themselves with the colonizer because that's who's providing their resources and things. So here's the Basque experience.
The Scottish referendum taught us that it is not easy to win a referendum when the state has the tools to use anything, fake news, fear, anything. And then also we learned from the Catalans that a negotiated referendum is going to be impossible with Spain. Spain doesn't respect the right for self-determination, and neither does France. So we have to think of other ways to find an exit from this jail. It is frustrating because it's been ruled by almost 45 years by a nationalistic party in name, the Basque Nationalistic Party, but they haven't moved ahead. And the second party is also nationalistic. They are doing well in elections lately, really doing well. But it's like they have abandoned the independence agenda because they tell you now is not the moment. We cannot make angry the party in power in Spain because we are in a very weak situation, and if this party resigns and there are new elections, the right wing might come. So with this fear that the right wing in Spain will come, what we have is that our nationalistic parties are supporting the Spanish state and the Spanish structures and making it stronger, and that's not in our interest.
That's interesting, isn't it? When we were talking to Alf, he had the same concerns about the Scottish government as run by the SNP, because he was saying they're sort of in the position of perpetuating the Westminster establishment, which of course is who created the Parliament. Because they were created by the state, it's very hard for them to act outside that, because that's where they get their legitimacy from. But it means to their supporters who get frustrated because we're maybe don't appear to be making progress towards independence. I think he said no nationalist government has ever achieved independence. It's been a civic movement or a protest movement that has made it happen.
Yeah. I'd certainly go along with actually what makes an independence movement strong and what eventually brings independence is more likely to be a really strong grassroots, civic movement. And I'd certainly go along with that. I mean, the other bit about, well, even what the speaker said about the Basque situation. I know nothing about the Basque situation. But I think there are reasons why. So coming back to Scotland, I think there are reasons why the Scottish government isn't ever going to declare UDI. That is not going to happen, and that doesn't necessarily, I think, mean that they've sort of given up and aligned themselves with Westminster or feel beholden to them. I don't think that's actually true at all of the SNP. But what is true is if there's not progress towards independence, then those of us who want independence get impatient. That's certainly true. I do think the answer is to not to abandon the politicians, because we need the politicians, but they really, really need us. They need us pushing from not different directions, but just in a different way. That's my tuppence worth.
Well, and then the third clip from the Basque perspective, she had some thoughts on where they needed to go, which, again, very interesting.
Some people think that this is the approach being realistic and going step by step. Others, we think that we must try to break away now from Spain and stop supporting Spain and the government. So that the only way ahead is disobedience, is awareness campaigns, is municipalities working on declaring independence on their own, like it has happened the unilateral way, and also creating synergies with other people. And that's why I'm glad to be attending this conference.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
I think she's assuming that the nationalist government that they've got the best, it's a sort of gradualist approach. But having said at the beginning, they haven't got time to wait. They are looking at other things, and Catalonia was the next area. It's quite short, but it was quite interesting about the sort of approach of the Catalan movement as to how they chose to present their campaign.
The Catalan team in charge of the coordination of the popular referendums back in 2009-11 did so by carrying high and proud the common flag of democracy, inviting other movements to join in. That's how I met Shona McAlpine, and together with the Flemish, we founded ISEC. Then in 2013, we collected almost 1 million signatures in Europe in support of the universal right of self-determination, with again the same core idea repeated. It's about democracy. And we're grateful to say it once again here today, 2014, thanks to the Scottish Independence Convention. It's all about more, better, a stronger democracy.
We used to hear a lot more about democracy when it was Nicola Sturgeon was the First Minister in terms of our independence and also following the Brexit debacle, that democracy was being denied to us.
Yeah, that's true. And that's the big Brexit being the big example of where that worked so much against us being part of the UK. But it does in most of the general elections.
The second clip, bit of an eye-opener for me, just how big Catalonia is. The other thing I found quite interesting was I have heard it said that the Catalans had the advantage of multiple independence media channels that we don't have. That may not be the case.
For those who don't know much about the past and the present of Catalonia, which can well happen even though, or maybe because, you have read a vast amount of mainstream media news with not much space for an independent site. The nation of Catalonia was already a reality in the turning of the first millennia, a sovereign territory with an established system to organize its internal and external relations. First written text found to date, and a seal emblem embraced as a national flag. 1,000 years ago. Second, the nation of Catalonia is also known as Catalan countries, as it refers to the Catalan-speaking territory of 15 million inhabitants, which includes South Catalonia, what is now known as Catalonia within the Spanish state, North Catalonia within the French state, País Valencià, Mallorca, Menorca, Ibiza, Formentera, the state of Andorra, La Franja, and the city of Alge.
That was an eye-opener to me as well. I didn't know that all of those places were linked with by speaking Catalan. It is quite something, and it just gets us back to that whole thing about a language. A language is part of what binds a nation together.
And its culture, and the fact it's 1,000 years old. I mean, we say about Scotland we're a 1,000-year-old nation, but we are actually in a better position because we're not split across other states. We just happen to be tacked onto the end of one state. Yeah,
and also I'm assuming that it was never a situation where the Catalans went into a union with Spain. I'm assuming that, Spain is itself a conglomeration of smaller kingdoms that were gradually taken over by, a powerful king, and one would step into the next one and take over, and then marriages of between royal families. So presumably it was this gradual sort of process of accretion that put together the Spanish nation as it is now, without there being quite like the kind of 1707 treaty that we've got. I mean, maybe that puts us at an advantage, since you can at least start off and say, we've had enough,
But do you know what it reminded me of? Was that conversation we had a couple of weeks ago when Isabel Lindsay said, after empires break up, was the example she used, they don't always end up with the borders in the right places for the groupings of people in there. And maybe that's the case here. And speaking of language, this is the third clip. Again, we get a little more insight into that.
Yeah.
So Catalan language, with all its dialects, is a reality in 4 states: Spain, France, Italy, and Andorra. This last one, Andorra, grants the Catalan language the status of being a UN's official language. This status is still denied by the European institutions, even though Catalan has more speakers than many other languages which are UE official. We repeat once more, it's about democracy to let people speak their language when being represented in the official spaces of European governance.
15 million people share this language, and that's bigger than a lot of the official languages. There's parallels there with us in Scotland looking at Scots being given the same protections as Gaelic. And I suppose Welsh is another example where people are given, you've got the choice of it in English or Welsh, and that's deliberate policy. We've not quite got that, but
we've got it certainly in a lot of things for Gaelic. You can download. Usually, if you're on the Scottish Government website, there's nearly always a thing you can click if you want it in Gaelic. Not in Scots.
If you listen to the Welsh Senate, they speak interchangeably in English and Welsh, and there's always a translation for those who don't have the other language. I would love to see that in our parliament, even if it was only occasionally. I know they've had one or two speeches in Gaelic, but wouldn't it be lovely if the actual Gaelic speakers could use their own language, and then the rest of us could hear it? Yeah. Okay, now we're heading to Sicily, and this was one of the areas I didn't know that Sicily, I knew it was an area within Italy. I didn't know that they were seeking independence.
Sicily is a nation without a state, whose cultural and linguistic identity, as well as its economic development potential, find no room within the borders of the Italian state. There are various ways in which the oppression by central states manifests itself. One of these is certainly the oppression of the local language, in Sicily relegated to the status of a dialect and hindered by a suffocating linguistic centralism that prevents its spread and official recognition. The repression of local language, culture, and traditions is worsened by the material conditions in which the local economy finds itself, affected by some of the highest unemployment and the poverty rates in the European Union, widespread underdevelopment, and a lack of basic service. This situation serves to purpose of exploiting the territory, used by the state as a military base, logistical hub.
Loads of echoes there, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, it might be a couple of 100 years adrift, but that just sounds like the oppression in the Highlands, doesn't it? After the 45 rebellion, where the language and the culture was suppressed, and the economic down treatment of the area.
That's true, and I think what he was saying tunes in really well with how Alf Baird describes the way that Scots language and culture has been debased and laughed at in a certain sort of way over the years, and then there's that in itself that undermines confidence. It also means there's a lot of people who go, well, if I do want to get myself a decent job, actually, there's no point in carrying on with my really broad Fife accent. I better kind of smarten it up a bit, and if I want that job. Yeah,
and the other thing there at the end. They've had the indignity of their territory used as a military base and had its resources extracted. Well, huge parallels with us. Come and take all our resources, and by the way, park your submarines in our back garden.
Yeah, exactly.
I think in one way I was sort of, even by this time, only sort of 3 speakers in, I'm simultaneously annoyed at this repeating pattern of what's happening to people, including us, but equally heartened in a way that it's not just us. It's a funny kind of mix.
Yeah.
All of this leads to a mass exodus of Sicilians towards northern Italy and abroad, with alarming figures showing more than 800,000 Sicilians living abroad and 20,000 living the island annually, causing the depopulation in the interior areas and a percentage aging of the population.
So there you go. Population outflow, an aging population. Same as
well, and I suppose we have to say nothing about some of the Sicilian families who made themselves very powerful over in the States.
I'm starting to feel a little more sympathetic towards them.
Yes, I know. I mean, makes you wish you had a godfather, doesn't it? I mean, it was interesting he mentioned going up to northern Italy, which is the industrialized, heartland of Italy, around Milan and everything. And my mum's family, they went down to the Midlands. Some of them had jobs here in the textile trade, but to get anywhere further with it meant shifting down south. And there was several other people in that family who went down and ended up, settled in and around Nottinghamshire. And
my family, they came from the north and into Glasgow, because that was the industrial, what was available to them. But yeah, it's the same kind of pattern.
Mind you, to be fair, my other side of my family did the opposite. They came from Northern Ireland over to Greenock.
I mean, that was a popular route, wasn't it? Yeah.
10 years after the consultative referendum for the independence of Scotland, a journey, yours, which has been an inspiration and example for the whole independence movements in Europe, we believe that we, too, can start a process driven by this repeal referendum that can finally lead us to a referendum for the self-determination.
That's interesting, isn't it? That we sort of think of, we had to go in 2014 and we lost. But actually, that was inspiring movements right across Europe. And that's wonderful to know that.
Yeah, that's quite heartening, isn't it? Even although I don't always find it very heartening myself to be still here 10 years on. But there you go. Yeah.
Well, indeed. Okay, and on to Sardinia.
Sardinia has a history spanning thousands of years. And during this time, an advanced legal code for its time was created, the Carta del Logo, which lasted for centuries and was one of the first constitutions in Europe. With Sardinia inclusion in Italian state in 1861, Italian culture and history took over. We were taught to see ourselves as backwards, provincial, and to think of our language as just a dialect. This imposed narrative deeply affected how Sardinians view themselves. But today, with Assemblea Nazionale Sarda, we are trying to change that.
Again, same thing. Your language is just a dialect. You know, 1,000 years of history and culture and identity just disregarded.
We work to protect and to promote Sardinia's language, history, and culture. We organize regular events, local events like Sardinian language games, historical and Sardinian tracks, books presentation, and something else. But we also host two major national events. The first one, the most important one, is Sadie de Sardinia, is the National Day of Sardinian people, which celebrate the expulsion of the Piemontese in 1794. For many years, this important moment in our history was forgotten or minimized, but we are bringing it back to the heart of our culture, reminding ourselves that history matters. The second one, which is in place today and tomorrow in Sardinia, is the Faulas Festival, the Lies Festival, which aims to break down stereotypes about Sardinia. Our island is often seen as a place of myths, exotic folklore, but through Faulas, we tell the real stories of Sardinia, stories that show that richness and modernity of our culture. We are not people stuck in the past, we are a nation with a future, like you.
Festival of Lies, I like the sound of that. Counteracting all the myths that go out.
But also that, having the one that's the Sardinian, Day of Sardinia,
Yes.
to bring to mind, I think he said it was the Piedmontese that they ejected from Sardinia. I mean, that's 784, that's a lot earlier than Bannockburn, and those and the wars of independence that had Wallace and Bruce in them. But it's a bit similar. So that was us kicking them out of Scotland, which gave us a few hundred years more of being an independent country before then a different, a more subtle kind of shift happened with the Treaty of Union. But it's interesting, isn't it?
And that point you made about history matters,
Yeah.
You're going back a long, long way. That's part of the strength of their culture, is how far back it goes. And interesting that they had what he said was the earliest constitution in Europe. Now, we think of, the Declaration of Arbroath as being an early form of our constitution, but I think he was even earlier than that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. And also it brought that particular way he put things brought to mind that recent discussion and conversation you and I had with Mary Sutherland, the filmmaker, about even yet Scots are not taught much about Scots history at school. And there's that lack of knowing our own history. And then from a filmmaker's point of view, there's the ability to put that in a enjoyable, exciting, even way on the screen and find
Yes.
out, find stories that, even though they might not, some of them are actually significant historical moments, but they don't need to be. They can be little things where you just get a sense of how Scots went about things and how they went about things maybe a bit differently from other people. So yeah, there's ways in, there's different ways in to try and tackle that lostness about who we are.
Yeah, and that false narrative, and in our case, the too wee, too poor, too stupid thing, that whole kind of counteracting that with this making a festival around it. Here's all the things you think you know and you're wrong. Here's, they're myths, they're not true. Here's what the truth is. That would be quite I don't know how you would actually structure it. It might be interesting to find out a bit more about how they do it. And he mentioned there also about, did you say the Sardinian Games as well, which I presume is a sporting kind of event.
Yeah. And also, I think, I do think that there's something though about our view of ourselves that on the one hand, it's true there's been a undermining of our view of ourselves as distinctly Scottish. I'm not denying that at all. But in our case, being part of Great Britain meant being part of the Great British Empire. And, a lot of Scots went out and did pretty well in that. And that also became part and parcel of how we see ourselves. And in that way, it's a success story in as much as the British Empire was successful in terms of bringing wealth back to Britain. Very successful if you lived in one of those countries, but mostly. So I just think it's a funny kind of mixture that we kind of find ourselves in terms of how we think about ourselves. Anyway, it's all good stuff, this, isn't it?
Who's next was one of our favourites of the day. She was a great speaker, and she brought a completely unexpected dimension. Well, I wasn't aware, other than having read Miss Miller's Feeling for Snow, when there was a little bit of a reference to Greenland being ruled by Denmark. But this speaker brings to light, unfortunately, quite a common thing that happens to Indigenous people. We know that the same things happen to Australian Aborigines, for example, the Native Americans. But this is also her story, and it is a little bit harrowing, actually.
I'm going to talk a little bit about our history, because we were colonized by a Norwegian priest who came to Greenland in 1721. And sometimes people ask me, when did the independence movement happen or start? And I always say that it started then. We don't have it in our history books, but I'm sure that my ancestors were fighting colonization then, and we still are today. In 1953, when the UN was founded, it was no longer an option for Denmark to keep Kalaallit Nunaat as official colony. And they were smart enough, in their own opinion, to convince our people that we could be a municipality of Denmark, even though our country is so far away from Denmark. They basically put us in as a territory of Denmark. Then from the 50s and in the 60s, the Danish government put in a lot of laws that were not in our favor. They were basically, I refer to this part of our history as the worst part of colonization, because it was a lot of violence that were happening then, especially for women and children. They put in different experiment, they called them, when they were taking children away from our island and placed them in Danish homes to make them Danes. It recently has been come out that there was a IUD campaign to sterilize our women. I have to say this because it's something that everyone in Greenland has been affected by. It's in everyone's family that this has happened.
Well, that's horrific, isn't it? But not unique in terms of the way particularly Indigenous groups have been treated in the past.
It's been what came to light relatively recently about how the Canadian Indigenous people were similar about kids being taken out of their family, put into big schools, and the basic kind of aim is to make them Canadians rather than still identifying with their particular kind of Indigenous tribal background. Yeah.
It's that assumption that where they've come from is inferior, therefore they're rescuing them. The lack of power of the Indigenous people compared to the colonizer is just what allows these things to happen. It surprised me we've covered Denmark, the state of happiness, and Denmark today, they don't have the same relationship with Greenland as we're about to hear some of the changes that have been made, but it just shows you that it's not that long ago and it's not that far away.
It wasn't that long ago. Yeah.
Then in the 70s, there was a big movement that happened then for independency, and in 79 we managed to get a home rule, which meant that we were able to take home the governments of culture, education, health, and different other important areas, but somehow also the kind of softer areas, I would say. So in 2009, we voted yes to have a self-government, which meant we took home more areas, but still today we are under the Danish constitution, even though we never voted for it. 32 different areas like foreign policies, just like the ferries, are controlled by the Danish government. And those are areas we obviously want to be in control of ourselves. And also 2009 was the first time that our people were recognized as a people, even though we still, in my passport, it says I'm a Dane, I'm Danish. We don't have a way to be recognized as Inuit.
We feel that, don't we, every time we get our passport out and it says British.
Exactly, yeah. She was very moving. The way she spoke was just affected me quite a lot, actually. And I think, I know we don't have time for it, but she read out a poem. She wrote, hadn't she? And it was very moving. I had a chat with her later on. I really, really enjoyed speaking to her. Just appreciated what she had to say, but there's quite a lot of, you just go away with a sort of sadness as well when you hear facts like that being brought to light.
The third clip from our Greenlandic lady was what fired them up.
In 2020, there was this happening where our prominent colonizer statue that's placed in Nuuk were painted, and with that also the fire was lit again for the decolonization and the independent movement that I'm happy to be a part of today. And I also want to recognize that I stand upon the shoulders of other people before me who fought for this to be happening. So yeah, very short, but that's a recap of what's happening in Greenland. We are fighting for full autonomy and independence from Denmark.
So painting a statue, which one shall we pick? And then in the break, you actually interviewed. So here's the interview that you did with her.
It was a bit of an eye-opener what you said about some of the things that happened. Yeah. Because we normally think Denmark, very liberal,
very nice,
open-minded, great place to live. Obviously not the whole story from your point of view. So are you optimistic about things changing in in Greenland?
If I don't have hope, then what do I have? I have to. I really feel like, because my parents' generation, they fought this, but I don't want to leave my kids having the same fight all over again. So I think it's so important to push it. I mean, we come so far. We can just, I think for me, it's sometimes maybe I am being called naive, but it's like, let's just do it.
Yeah, let's just do it on street, like you said in your poem, let's stream a bit. So is it like here in Scotland, it's maybe about 50-50, not quite. What's the support like in Greenland?
Well, it's quite interesting because I think generally people are really pro that we become independent. I think the biggest difference is when it's going to happen. So it's a question of if I ask people, can we do it tomorrow? Only very few people would be ready for that. And I think generally people say in 2033, that's when they want to be independent.
It's very specific.
Something like if you push it together, something like So I think that's also why politically people are insecure about pushing the election, because what if it doesn't come through? Then what do we have? Because that argument would be very strong for Denmark to use against us, but you had the chance and you didn't take it. So I think that's the concern there.
Yeah, which is exactly the position we're in.
Yeah.
You know, well, you've done it, and then there was all this stuff about it was once in a generation, which is nonsense. Although it's getting to be the point where it almost is once in a generation.
Yeah.
Greenland must also be affected by climate change a lot just now.
Yes.
And your Inuit traditional ways of life would be having to
are affected by it.
Affected by it.
But the thing is also that Inuit always have been very innovative and very adjusting to whatever climate there is, because we still live with nature. We are depending on being able to hunt and fish, and so we have also a huge respect for nature, and that we don't control it, that it controls us. And I think that's the difference between how, for instance, in Europe, how they're trying to control the nature, I think there's a difference there in how we see our connection to the land. I think there's something completely wrong about another government controlling your lands and your abilities to be a people. So I think that's fundamentally wrong.
And that's what we're agreeing on.
Who knew when we got up that morning that we were going to end up interviewing a lovely Inuit lady?
It was so nice. Yeah, and I mean, you know, what she said about the land kind of resonates with us, doesn't it? You know, feeling that sense of belonging to your land, and there's a responsibility there, but also to a certain extent the land can look after you as well, as long as it's reciprocated. You know, I suppose that applies to everyone everywhere, but it applies to the way that connection I feel to the land of Scotland. So when she said that, I was completely with her. But I mean, the thing, you know, with Greenland, I mean, they don't have a large population. More and more of their actual land is being visible because the ice sheets are retreating, and it's well known that there are a lot of very, very valuable mineral deposits in Greenland. And, you know, I mean, obviously Denmark government knows that as well. But that land, although the island's huge, small number of people, independent, you can see they'd have to be really, really on the ball to not allow that other people to come in, you know, whether it was big business, whether it was the United States, whether it was China.
Oh, and even the trade route. I mean, if the ice retreats, so they end up that being a trade route, then you can see the pressure to have refueling and ports and, you know, all sorts.
It's so complicated, this sort of thing, isn't it? Like you pull a thread and become more independent, and then other things open up that in some ways are dangers that you'd really have to look out for yourself. But then that's the point of being independent, isn't it? That you do have to look out for yourself. You can't turn down to London or Copenhagen and say, hey, you need to sort this out. It'll be it will be the Greenlanders and themselves who'll have to sort stuff like that out.
The next speaker is from Flanders.
At the heart of the Flemish movement is a Flemish patriotic interpretation of how the unique identity of our Flemish community should be continuously explored and strengthened. To maintain that what we are, as a result of our history, traditions, culture, language, and the prominent principle that was often the central topic in our hymns. We want to be free, to be able to live and function in a system that corresponds with our democratic wishes and preserve our way of life, despite efforts of powers that aim to extinguish it through the ages. In 1830, when the country of Belgium was founded, the Flemish found themselves in a system that was designed to break their cultural identity. The mother tongue of the majority of the, for a great part, impoverished population of this state was disrespected in all levels that make for a fair and democratic society, like higher education, jurisdiction, administration, and so on. Those who would not give up their identity, their language, could but dream of progressing on the social ladder. Dutch-speaking people like myself became in fact second-rate citizens. What started as a cultural Flemish movement to break this cycle of discrimination throughout the long 20th century turned into a patriotic political machine to achieve self-government for the Flemish on a cultural and a political level. After many troublesome episodes, sacrifices and mistakes concerning choices in the methods to gain this autonomy as a nation, we now have a regional parliament that in past years has received more and more responsibilities. With exactly half of the seats in this parliament now in possession of the Flemish patriotic parties, it would only be logical that it becomes the motor for more autonomy and, of course, in the end, independence from an archaic state system that is unfit to deal with current and future internal and external difficulties.
And the next one is the Welsh speaker.
We've had the Age of Empire. It came, it rose, it failed. We've had the violence of the 20th century. We've had the often violent and toxic nationalism of the 20th century. A stick which is often used to beat those movements that are nationalist today, even though those movements have changed radically. And perhaps what we need to do is to recapture the idea of liberty as the foundation for our goals, as nations, as regions, whether those goals are greater autonomy, greater self-determination, or independence. That fundamental foundation, that idea of liberty that underlies everything, that is the key. And in a sense, it is the key to persuading our nations and our people of the need for the freedoms that we seek. Because we often have people with very different political views, very different views indeed. And occasionally we find that our movements are split. They are riven by those who have their own utopian view of the independent future of their nation or the autonomy of their nature, of their nation. I used to joke a year or two ago that there were potentially 3.14 million different views of a future Wales in Wales. There were only 3.14 million people living in Wales. And you have to have something to unite all of those people to achieve that dream. Here in Scotland, it's particularly pertinent. You've been stuck, I believe, on 45 to 55% for 10 years. And something needs to move that dial. Something has to push it across that barrier to 55 to 60. And perhaps the ideal and vision of liberty, well represented and well communicated, can help in that endeavor, because it does unite people from across the spectrum.
Interesting thought. So that's one person suggesting use democracy as the peg to hang it on, and he's suggesting liberty. Maybe use them both.
Well, yeah, and they're not really pegs quite, are they? I mean, it seemed to me they're suggesting them more as the kind of, foundation stones, really. He was very persuasive, wasn't he? Very good speaker. Yeah. Yeah,
but both platforms that you would not expect people to disagree over, maybe how you do it, but not the actual reason for it. Yeah. And the last speaker was from Ireland.
It's great to see this internationalisation of progressive forces. The far right was mentioned earlier, and you better believe that they're internationalising. They're sharing strategies, tactics, all manners of information that makes them more potent across the globe. There were riots in Dublin, for example, in November last year, and it was said that the far right internationally, through Twitter, had a huge impact in basically storing up the riots. So the far right are a potent threat across the globe, and to push back against them, we need to internationalise and work in a mutual, cooperative way globally as well. So it's great to see that this does that.
That was just, I thought, a really, really good point. They are very, very good at internationally organising, and we're watching them do it, but we're not doing it ourselves.
Yeah, we're watching them doing it, and we're being affected. You know, we're being affected through social media platforms in particular. But yeah, just as well, also in terms of strategies and, you know, people like Steve Bannon, you know, coming out from behind Trump, and then I mean, he's been all over Europe, kind of talking to those sorts of groups, and their message in particular to particular parts of a population, and young men is obviously one of them.
And then you've got Elon Musk, the ultimate bro, as he's being called, billionaire bro. And again, appealing to that same group of disaffected young men, the Andrew Tate kind of lookalikes, as they were described. And it is seriously worrying that they're open to that kind of influence.
Yeah,
Ireland's history, as a lot of you will know, is deeply intertwined with colonisation, especially from the 16th century onwards. When it became a testing ground or a laboratory really for British imperialism, those same sort of racist structures and ideologies were transplanted then to America and wiped out the native indigenous populations there. So they aimed to suppress the Irish language, culture and political autonomy. The plantation policies, for instance, displaced native Irish populations, and in schools Irish children were subjected to indoctrination such as reciting verses that celebrated being a happy English child. The goal was clear, to either assimilate or eradicate Irish identity. But the British were only partially successful in this. Various forms of resistance emerged over the centuries, some of them militant, some of them constitutional. Others focused on cultural and linguistic preservation. That's where the organisation that I'm a member of, Mishnach, really comes in terms of cultural decolonisation. But I suppose, looking at the history of Ireland, the struggle for independence was only partially successful as well. The Irish Revolution of 1916 to 1923 ended with a partial autonomy for 26 of the 32 counties. But partition left the north under a supremacist Protestant government. The division of the island has stifled democracy, and it has exacerbated economic imbalances too. The West, where the Irish language remains strongest, has been hard hit by emigration due to a lack of economic opportunities, while a lot of the economic opportunity is focused around Dublin. There's a major imbalance between East and West. The Irish elite, who previously looked to Britain for their financial and economic interests, now look to multinationals, US multinationals, foreign direct investment and so forth. They're really what you might call a comprador class who manage wealth on behalf of global financial capital. This has led to an economy overly reliant on these aspects, and there's dire consequences then for ordinary people: housing, healthcare, education. There's a crisis in the cost of living. There's crisis in numerous sectors, deep social inequality. In the north, the intransigence and threats of unionist elements hold back self-determination, progressive change, and even a modicum of Irish language rights for Irish speakers. Only this week there were Irish language classes to be organised in a unions-dominated area in County Antrim, and loyalist paramilitaries issued threats of violence to burn down the community centre in which they be held. In the south, the use of Shannon Airport for the transport of arms to the Israeli Zionist state, facilitating the slaughter of Palestinians, and the increasing military influence of NATO, the EU, and the US threatens Ireland's long-standing policy of neutrality. This policy, rooted in an anti-colonial understanding and a rejection of empire, is at risk of being undermined. The Scottish Gaelic poet Sorley MacLean once referred to the bitter legacy of colonialism, noting how it endangered indigenous languages, drove emigration, and empowered what he called the porters of international big business. This same colonial legacy continues to shape Ireland's struggles today. That said, if autonomy had not been gained in 1922 for a part of the country, the challenges facing Ireland, particularly the social problems I alluded to, would without doubt be far greater, and neutrality wouldn't even be something to contest. Looking to the future, there is reason for optimism. Demographic shifts in the north of Ireland have made the possibility of a united Ireland more realistic than ever before. Even right-wing and centrist parties in the south are now getting on board with the idea that there could be a united Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 stipulates that a referendum on reunification can only take place if the British Secretary of State allows for it, or he believes a majority would vote in favour of it. That's a hurdle that will not be easily overcome. Ireland has come a long way from its days under colonial rule. The country still grapples with the effects of that legacy. Nevertheless, with increasing momentum towards a reunification and an increasingly left-leaning youth, and a youth not as shackled by post-colonial syndrome as previous generations, the country stands at a pivotal moment in its history.
There's a lot in that, wasn't there?
Yeah, there is. Actually, what occurred to me when he was talking, particularly the bit about, Ireland. Well, yeah, there was the Civil War, and then, there was the 26 counties got their independence, but all of that sort of struggle, there was still such a lot of overlap and dependency on Great Britain even then, and that obviously shifted when both Britain and Ireland joined the EU, which was the mid-70s, wasn't it? But actually, what I was thinking there was, in some ways, Brexit has maybe, although it's been catastrophic, it's been catastrophic all over the UK, but certainly here in Scotland, and we didn't vote for it. I think, well, maybe actually Brexit has just helped push it a bit further, cut more of the ties, especially the trade ones. Ireland, since Brexit, Ireland has opened up umpteen ferry routes and commercial cargo routes, as well as probably passenger ones, straight over to various ports in the EU. Whereas before that all went through England, Wales and England. So you kind of think, well, maybe for them that's sort of, they've had to take another few steps along that journey, and yeah, good for them, really. Wish we were in the same position.
One of the things I really found interesting about that speech was that partly the whole colonial influence on Ireland, but also the fact that their current economy is based around servicing global businesses, and how they're focusing on how they can best make billionaires richer, whilst not providing services like housing and healthcare and education to the standard that their own citizens want.
But yeah, I was just struck when he said they're in this position where they're servicing multinational corporations. And I just think that there's a bit of a danger of Scotland ending up maybe doing a bit of that as well. Once we are independent, I was thinking, I so do not want Scotland to go down that line. Let's apply our expertise to, creating things in our own country for ourselves, but also for the benefit of people elsewhere. But don't let us just go down the line of making more money for companies that are already got far too much money.
So that was just a taster of some of the speakers, not all of them, some of the speakers from the conference, the Owning Our Future. And next week, we're going to bring you some of the highlights from the Q&A session. So there's more to tease out of that afternoon, but hope you found that interesting. We certainly learned a lot.
Yep.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll catch you all later. Bye
Yep.
now.